we need to invest in understanding the other side. That's actually my key part of what I want to bring across. You want to understand that they're politicians, you understand that how bureaucrats work, you have to understand how human beings work a little bit better to actually being effective. So, but we tend to push. Okay, there's lots of ways of pushing, and you know, July showed that pushing can be effective. You know, we're living through revolutionary times and things can change. But what can change and does immediately is the past goes away, but doesn't mean that the future is secured. And meanwhile, you know, and it's a pattern, and it's not trying to be disrespectful, but I do it with a little bit of an ironical smile. Just as in so many other countries, I've watched street-based reform processes, like in Sudan, the street was suddenly in power, and who then in the end holds the power is the suits. And so we have the same kind of thing, fairly, you know, suited people that suddenly then brought in, because the street can't run a country, it's the suits that are coming there. And I'm not, just as in Sudan, the suits are incredibly well-meaning. And so there is a thing. So we talk a lot about, oh no, this is the moment, and we're going to get, and in fact the code word, and it is there as well, in fact behind it all, is accountability. Okay, so everything is around accountability. External accountability, democratic processes and freedom of speech and making sure that's enshrined. Internal accountability, all to do with corruption, patronage, you know, we need to cut it out. I was reading, and yesterday talking to some of the authors of the white paper on the economic thing, and it goes all the way, you know, get my data at least right and whatever it is. And so, you know, it's worthwhile. But there is something that whenever I'm in these situations that reminds me, and I lived through it in 10 years in the UK, inside government, that there is this basic principle that a lot of people on the other side probably underwrite to something an Italian writer, de Lampedusa, wrote in The Leopard. If we want things to change, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. And so basically it often gets put like, you know, if we want to keep things as they are, we do change because we want to keep things as they are. Okay, and so there is a real risk in these processes that all the change is really going to in the end captured so that all can stay the same. Okay, and you know, this is not unrealistic here. Political government may come in, and you know, their record in the past is not that beautiful either. Okay. Despite what we say about the last 15 years, the perceptions of corruption index, the ranking of Bangladesh is actually the same as 17 years ago. The indicators, okay, the World Bank is a little bit discredited with data these days, but they collect accountability data and worldwide governance indicators. Actually, the ranking of Bangladesh is actually improved in the last 16, 17 years. Now, you can worry about it, but it definitely hasn't gone down. So actually, and you know what that means, 15, 16 years, that's the previous political government from the other party. So you get it there. So we just have to understand it's going to be very hard to change things. Very, very hard. Right. So how can you be more effective? Now, one of the things is that there's some people in the room, and I'm sure, and I respect these, but maybe I reach the age that I'm not quite thinking we're going to keep on struggling and we're going to go back on the street. You know, there's one scenario, we're going to keep on being on the street and we're going to have street justice as a way of getting overall justice approved. I'm probably more of the kind of thing, if you want things to stick, it's always about building successful, dominant coalition that want to change to happen. It's not consensus, you know, don't believe everyone interprets it as consensus, there won't be. But actually a dominant coalition that's strong enough, with legitimacy, because there's plenty of dominant coalitions possible of one leader, but you want actually with enough legitimacy. And at the moment that coalition, of course, is remarkably limited within the powerful groups in society. At the moment a coalition seems to be, and it's somehow probably a bit in the room, students, youth, civil society. Now that's not a dominant coalition, okay? Political parties condone it, but they're not quite there. Civil servants, the ones I talk to, feel very skeptical. They respected, but I feel very skeptical. And politicians of the parties that are remaining are all eyeing our moment will now come. It soon be our time to eat, as they tend to say, or at least in some countries. And then finally, the business community, where are they? They're also there. So normally, dominant coalitions for change, for progress in societies, tend to involve broader, if we look at changes in, say, in the economic and the political space after the fall of Suharto in Indonesia in '97, they did include business community was there, civil servants were there, and so on. So the coalition is still quite weak. So we have to just make sure, somewhere or another, one does things that can be sufficiently inclusive, not in the normative SDG type of term, but actually inclusive of those people who have all the power and the ability to squash everything within 5 years. So there's a perfectly plausible scenario. And to be honest, it's not the worst scenario that you can imagine. It's like Indonesia after the fall of President Suharto after the Asian crisis in 1997. I'm sorry, this is before your time, I know. But it's worth thinking a little bit about that they have these moments in history when, autocratic leaders with a party apparatus around it that were accused of amassing lots of wealth. The wife of President Suharto, her name was Tien Cent. Now the colonial language was Dutch there. In the Dutch would say 10 cent. That actually means 10%. You get it what we're getting at. Madame 10% she was called. You had a regime like that with lots of similarity. You got a big change on the street, a democratic transition. If we look back at it now entirely, things are, quite a bit better, but it's not as if totally everything is there. Corruption scandals are still there. There's still a lot of capture of certain groups and so on. But it's a bit better. I think that's probably, I will call it a success for Bangladesh, that in 5 years, there is enough things better in 5 years, and maybe looking a bit like Indonesia in its progress after Suharto. That would actually be a good thing. The development comes back, the growth comes back, some decent technocrats remain in government combined with the political government, and so on and so on. Anyway, so how can you get there? As one scenario, of course, it's totally right you hope for more, and so even my advice I will give you, maybe you can push for more. So it's 3 things you need to think about. Understand politics, political incentives, what do politicians want, understand what bureaucrats want and what they can and cannot do, and then again understand human beings. So let me quickly say a bit about each of these 3. So the first thing is, what do politicians want? Now, all over the world, whenever I meet them everywhere, they want, I had a few words here, but I think they want power, love, and legacy. They want power, because that's the game of politics. It's not being on the fringes, but actually you want to be in a position of power. By the way, they tend to usually have certain personalities, and I call it love or adulation, but they want to be liked. It's a good thing to play into, by the way, because they want to be liked, and they're very shocked when they suddenly realize they're not liked anymore, and they are furious, and they will say, it must have been the Americans that made me suddenly unloved or something. At the same time, they want legacy, okay? They like to deliver something. I've actually never met a politician, however odious they were in the UK, that some of the ones I worked with, that actually kind of wanted to do something. By the way, for better, for worse, but they wanted to do something, okay? So they want legacy. Now, but the key thing is, you have to understand that for them, the primary purpose has to be they have to have power. Because if they don't have power, they can't do any of the others. They can't create the love for them. They can't create a legacy either. Now you need to understand that, because it means you keep on suggesting the best possible things to do in policy, whether it's in the United Kingdom or in Bangladesh. And obvious glaring indicators on poverty or indeed on economic performance and so on say, surely you don't want to do it. But you have to understand it, that changing this may not necessarily offer them power. There's very few governments that get elected because, rationally speaking, somehow a report by the United Nations or a think tank told them, you know, you were really great. And so they said, oh yeah, let's now stand up and applaud them. Governments get kicked out for all kinds of reasons. And actually, politics is pretty raw. Most politics, not least in these countries, but in lots of other places, it requires, you know, of course people vote for you. But getting people to vote for you is expensive. Politics is expensive, you know. In any country in the world, from the US to Nigeria to Bangladesh, politics is very expensive. So you kind of get indebted to groups of people that you need to reward. And you may need to reward them in terms of jobs. You may need to reward them in terms of contracts. You may need to reward them in all these kind of ways that are broad forms of patronage. Now, I'm not trying to be cynical, but, you know, just look at who Mr. Trump appoints in his cabinet. You know, that's the same. That's not different. You can ask, and you wouldn't know the names, but I can tell you a list of people that get appointed in the UK, in the House of Lords and so on. It's patronage, it's reward. It's, you know, certain things will not change. You know, the UK, you know, you have far too many MPs that have links with the gambling industry. You keep on asking why. Well, they have a lot of liquidity, the gambling industry, and they pay for people's offices and so on. And it's not illegal, but it's there, okay? So you have to just understand it's there. And so once you know that actually you either need to make sure that the people that support you and keep you in power, you know, via the normal process of what we tend to call clientelism, you know, the kind of normal thing that you need to reward those people who put you in power. It comes with democracy, whether it's a perfect or an imperfect one, it comes with it. That you need to, you know, you need to get your marginal constituents, your voters happy and so on, and it may include certain people that can dominate vote banks and so on. So it basically restricts the things that you will do. So not everything that is right works politically, okay? Not least in a moment of reform, okay? But let me give you a very simple example, but it does mean that, say, for example, that if the things are not salient work politically, they won't happen. You know, we all talk about learning crisis in a country like this. In fact, we talk all over the world about learning crisis. I've not, and I'm actually actively trying to look for it, I've not come ever a politician who really basically in a practical way makes their election manifesto in a real direct way around learning outcomes. Because, woo, it's a pretty risky one because it's so hard. It's all system-wide reforms, it's lots of things that need to come in place. But I know plenty of politicians that have, at some point or another, advocated for free primary education, free secondary education, free university education, because, oh, it's really salient. And does it really work? You know, in the UK, we are pretty constrained. You know, the government doesn't give us money anymore as universities per student, so we need to raise the money, but then they cap the fees because politically it's very salient. And basically it means that a lot of universities are going bankrupt. Yeah, okay, fine, you know, is that the way you want to do it? But because it's salient. Another example is that it's much more salient to campaign around we're going to build 1,000 schools, or we're going to build, or we're going to hand out laptops to per each child. And the laptop per each child is something globally is being used by politicians. It's actually a very funny one because it's so particular. There's plenty of excellent evaluations on it, and there's not a single country that it ever improved learning outcomes. In fact, there's countries, but it worsened learning outcomes by handing out laptops to children, because all the things. But why do they do it? Because it's, wow, it's an asset transfer. It sounds very good, you know, we'll go and get it. So it's salient in politics. You know, Kenya had an excellent education program which it scrapped, working with USAID. When Kenyatta was campaigning for the presidency and he went for a program on 1 laptop per child, $420 million later, not a single improvement on anything, it was quietly scrapped. You know, that's $500 million, is a decent amount of money, and so on. But it's salient, it worked. And it was one of the 3 or 4 principles in the manifesto for the elections. Okay? So you have to understand it has to work. it gets a bit more subtle. It also, you know, all the campaigning around accountability. Now, if politics is expensive, of course, at the moment, every political party will say, yes, yes, we're going to have more accountability. But you do know it will have limits. Because the politics you know is based on patronage. It's not based on anything else. It's to a large extent based on patronage, especially the raising of money for it. You know, you're not going to really be able to quickly change this. You may limit a bit of the most grand corruption, but a lot of it is going to be very hard to change. And the reason is really because, you know, a lot of these kind of accountability changes, they risk having lots of winners, but also losers, okay? And so losers will also be in the political class because that's their influence relative to the business community. That's their influence. It's the game they play. Now, again, I don't want to be cynical and saying, therefore, give up and go away, but just have to be aware of that. And you just have to think about it. And in fact, it gets a little bit worse. And one of the risks with a lot of the accountability actions is that those that target the previous party, that previous AL, and actually somehow shields the interests of the other parties, has more chance of success. Now, would you call that an improvement? Would you call it an improvement that you skew the patronage system in favor of certain groups? But that's often how these things will work, and we've seen that in places. At the same time, you know, these things are easily reversed. Okay, and so we get this risk of a bit of victor's justice, you know, kind of, well, we've won, we're going to squash your interests and squash your business interests and your connections. Meanwhile, we don't worry about ours. And, you know, I spent my morning asking ChatGPT who are the influential business leaders linked to BNP. And it's getting an interesting list because ChatGPT is thinking very actively about it. And funnily enough, we kept on asking, the list got longer and longer. It's as if they suddenly all emerge now. So you have to be aware of that, what these interests are, because it will limit what will go easily through and what won't. Now, I'm not trying to say, therefore, you should only do the things that go easily through. But if you do advocacy, you need to understand that. Because the losers, the potential losers, will be the spoilers. And they will do all they can to do it. Okay? So you need to think about it. So maybe to conclude on that bit is that, well, you need to do a bit of that analysis. You know, when you do your matrix, the column that's missing is, who will try to block this? And just explicitly ask within the political space, who will try to block this? Why would they want to block this? And understand more deeply, and can go all the way to names of organizations, to associations, to things, and know it. Endless education reforms are blocked by teacher unions. Because teacher unions are not simply well-meaning, motivated teachers that got together, but they are typically, in most countries, political organizations linked to power. Okay? One way or another. I'm not saying it is here, I don't know. But I know that in Kenya, good reforms were blocked because the teacher union agitated about it, and it was nothing to do with the children. It had all to do with their own interests and the power that they had. So you need to know that, and you need to think about it. Now it comes back to coalition building. You need to know who you need to bring on board, because these are moments in time that within these organizations, reform coalitions also emerge. You know, there will be amongst this kind of equivalent, whether it's amongst the garment people or the teacher unions, there will be people that actually also are capturing the mood. And you think, okay, who do I need to have in the room is the ones that can actually build. You know, if you think of big reform episodes, there's probably no bigger one than China in the 1970s. Yeah, that's extremely well before your time. But you may have heard that in '79, Deng Xiaoping did massive reforms in the economy. It's within the same party. And if you talk to Chinese officials and scholars, they will never say Deng Xiaoping was the only person who did it. He had to build a coalition of reformers in the organization. So you need to go under the skin of the organizational structures that may block it and build up a reform coalition within it. Well-meaning politicians in the political parties, well-meaning vested interests, in well-meaning people in the other vested interests, and you work with it. And this is where I repeat again, where are the business people? Where are the associations in all this? If the coalition doesn't get broader, you're not going to get anywhere. And you need to find a way of talking to them and go under their skin. And you have to have a list of targets, of groups of people that actually say, look, we need to find a way of bringing them in the tent. Okay? And it's not everybody. It could be minorities. But the mood of the times would be to actually take them along. You can't leave it to the suits and just civil society. It will fail, I can assure you. It will just fail. It will be also as a result, I will unfortunately have to say, that involves, you know, that's my age probably, that I'm doing compromises. It will be a bit of compromises, focusing on a few things that you can do and not everything. Because you have to think of the sustainability. You have to think that there are some things will be spoiled so much that you just can't do it. And then actually you need to find a way of prioritizing. I think success in the political space will be a few things, but properly build up so that they can be sustainable. Few things that are hard to reverse. For example, a few things that in the public imagination are clear enough that they are hard to, that they work now politically, and that would be very hard to reverse. Complicated things, I fear the way judiciary will work and other things will work, it will go back to previous reform periods, that they will all be undone, as I understand, after 2007, 2008. Everything can be quickly undone, including in the courts. Okay, quickly on the other side. The second big thing here is a lot of focus is about what to do. This is also what the researchers do, it's what the advocacy groups do, the think tanks do. This is what should be done. Okay, I was reading the conclusions of the white paper on the economy, 8 pages of very vague what should be done. Okay, admittedly there's another paper coming, but I bet it will all be about what should be done. There is a problem that should be improved. A second main constraint is implementation. What is really not sufficient to get anything done if you don't have an idea of how it can be done? You know, civil service, the way it's described globally, the systems here are, you know, let's say they're not very highly ranked in their implementation strengths. In fact, if there was, to some extent, at least in the earlier period, maybe a bit less so in the last 15 years than publicized, a progress in development, a lot of people will say it was despite the state. It was despite the way it is, and indeed civil society played its role and so on. But it is despite the state, because the state is pretty dysfunctional. Now, suddenly saying, oh, now you need to do this, and then expecting them to go and do it, without understanding why it is so dysfunctional, is very, very naive. Okay? If you want reform and change and advocacy to be successful, you have to have another column. How hard would it be to implement? Is it, and don't believe that just changing one law in Parliament will be the solution. I'm tired of how many reform efforts all end up just with votes in Parliament. The parliamentary part is of course important, but that's only people that only have studied law. I know there will be a few of you, but that, I think that's the important thing. The main constraint in any bureaucracy in the world is implementation constraints, and is understanding implementation. Researchers don't study it. They all write their papers, that's what should be done, the policy implications are this. Now, you have to then think about what would be needed to be done. And within the capabilities we have, can we do it? And if you can't, you have to say, what will be the path towards getting the capabilities to do it? And it's a way of prioritizing, because things you can't in the window you have, maybe 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years at best, before the political government comes in, what you're going to do. So you have to think very carefully what can be done. It comes back to simplicity, because simple things can be implemented, difficult things. You know, there's going to be reports full of system changes in education and in health. Good luck with that if you can't get the whole thing going. So you have to be ruthlessly honest what can be implemented. And you have to understand that if you don't get them to own the reforms, it's not going to happen. At the moment, it's a very strange reform progress. Lots of suits, and then some extra suits brought in committees that are not having anything to do with this administration, my understanding, and they're writing these things. And then you think, oh, here is it. You know, it reminds me every time again we got a new minister. Oh, you're now going to do this. And then all the civil servants looked at them and think, yeah, are you sure? And then usually they already have a long document. In fact, that's what they will be writing, why they can't do certain things. And it's not because they're bad, okay? Okay, they have their vested interest too. I will admit to it. But even in the UK, which arguably has a non-politicized, well, it has a non-politicized civil service until Boris Johnson came, but they had a non-politicized civil service and a decent delivery strength. You know, it's still incredibly hard to get anything done. The ministers come and say, aren't you going to do this? And indeed, we usually have, in fact, this is almost, the election process is such that by the time a new government comes in, there's usually a file for each party that may be in power. And it basically more or less is a document, I think this is what you should be doing, rather than the political party giving the document. And actually, of course, in lots of the politics, and I worry about the politics here, if it is in a way, if it's continued as it was, they don't mind too much, because what the ministers do is the business of the party, of the connections, of the tenderpreneurs and the procurement stuff, the big projects. Yeah, you can do the rest, we don't really care. And in fact, in my experience, in most governments, especially when they have weaker state capability and less accountability, you know, the civil service do their stuff, the politicians don't really care, except for the things that is in their interest, that has political gain in the short term and so on. Now, a new political government may come in, but of course that's also the one we have now, that is used to just get on with things in the way they always did it. And probably the saying that I said earlier, if we want things to change as they are, things will have to change. Sorry, if we have to keep on reading it wrongly. If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. That's clearly the attitude at the moment of civil servants I talk to. Yeah, we'll reorganize a bit, restructure a bit, other units, some people moved up, moved down. But realize that. Now, if you don't think about these implementation constraints, the things that actually can be done, the things that you can actually push through. And by the way, just as it's in other associations or in business or in the political parties, it will also be about getting the coalitions within the civil service that actually want to change to begin to work together. You need to have a good sense of what is the capabilities of different departments. Some, maybe nothing can be delivered. I know in other countries, I work a lot in a few other countries, I know full well that let's not expect anything from that one. Let's not expect from agriculture in Malawi anything, because it's totally captured by the interest of the fertilizer industry. So we can't change it there. But we may have another place where we can do. And by the way, even in the civil service, success is contagious. If it begins to work and they get a recognition for it, then actually others will follow. But basically make sure you understand the implementation challenges and the institutional view. And then finally, across all this, understand that you're dealing with human beings. We like to say that we deal with institutional structures, you know, and yeah, there's always plenty of Marxist theory still around in Dhaka. They are there, of course. But it helps that if you want to do change, you'll still sit in a room like we do, or around the table negotiating with certain people. You're not negotiating or trying to persuade structures. You try to persuade individuals in the structures who have agency to do a bit, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more. And that's really helpful. So there's three things I think that behavioral science tells you. It's a bit like how to be the perfect spin doctor in working with politicians and bureaucrats. Behavioral science tells us, okay? There's a very simple thing. The first of all of us, they use shortcuts in the way we think about the world. People say we have a mental model of how the world works, how cause and effect works. if I do this, this will be the outcome. Okay? If I hand out money to the poor, they will all drink it. That could be a mental model, which is widely held, by the way. But others could have a mental model, if I give money to the poor, it will really empower them and they will graduate out of poverty. Now, I have to be careful here, as a famous person in this country wrote books about, if we unlock social entrepreneurship of the whole country, everything will overnight all start changing. I'm a bit in trouble with that because I wrote a damning review of that book at some point. I won't say it. But it's a mental model. You know, these are not necessarily totally evidence-based, but it's the way you want to think, the stories we want to tell, and the way we respond to the way we deal with it. You know, any politician, of course, they're merchants of storytelling. They're merchants of narratives. They're merchants of mental models. Okay, so again, a mental model is like a model that you have in your head about how the world works, the causalities. If you do this, that will be the outcome. If I do this, then I will vote. If I will do this, the economy will work better. Some of it can be true, some of it can be, usually it's all a shortcut, because we can't keep, even the best scientists can't keep all the science in their head. Best sociologists can't have the whole thing about society in their head. The best politicians can't get everything about the voting numbers and doing it like that. So they have shortcuts. They think intuitively, and intuition in that sense becomes shortcuts in the way you work. Now, if you go and try to do advocacy, you do well to understand and try to understand how does the other person around the table think. How do they think about the problems we're dealing with? So it's not about asking them what the problems are, it's actually trying to understand how they think about it. How do they think the causalities work? How does an economy actually work? How does a global economy, you know, a well-known example will now become, if we deal with Mr. Trump, how do tariffs actually work? Well, he tells a story and he has a mental model. By the way, he probably believes it the way he tells the story. Now, you better understand that if you want to argue against certain policy thing. If you have someone who believes vaccines causes more harm than any good, you need to understand how do they think about it, rather than saying, you're wrong. So you look, basically you start from that. Now there's a couple of things you need to know. You need to find the entry point. So if someone has, let's for example say, a very particular way of, say, accountability, and say, well, you know, we all need a bit of corruption to grease the wheels. Now, they may not tell you that in so many words, but there's plenty of people in businesses who actually like the status quo, and actually for a very simple reason, not because it enriches them massively, but they understand the system. They understand how it works. Okay? There was one episode in another country where there was suddenly a massive drive against corruption. It was in Tanzania. And the main thing we got from business is saying, yeah, we know there was a lot of corruption, but at least we knew how it worked. Now we don't know anymore how the system works. Now, if that's the mental model, just be careful how you want to work around accountability. Like, oh, now I'm going to once in a while punish a business person for doing it, and say, well, now I don't know how the system works, because I can still go to a ministry and they ask me for a bribe, but once in a while you put me in jail for it. I don't know how the system works. Oh, let me not do anything anymore. Now that's not very helpful. So you have to understand how they think about it and make sure you understand. Because if you want to persuade that you want to do something differently, you need to, and this is where evidence, and there I say advocacy around evidence comes into it. The simplest way to understand it is to try to correct people's mental models. You do advocacy because you want to make sure they have a bit more understanding. If you simply want to do it because you want to get in print in the newspaper in your photograph, that's fine, that's power, that's like a politician. But if you want it to change people's minds, it's about correcting the mental model people have. That means you have to understand the other side. Scientists don't get that. If they don't understand how the other side thinks, how can you improve it? And you keep on bombarding them with evidence and nothing changes. Well, better understand, even well-meaning people may just be convinced, not be convinced by what you offer, okay? That's the first thing. So you need to understand the mental model to actually act. The second thing is, and it's all done a bit related, to influence mental models, since they are shortcuts, since they're often the stories we tell of how the world works, you better get the right stories. And don't get a story that doesn't appeal to them. If I'm going to tell the story, try to convince somehow that giving money to poor people really is not being drunk or wasted, then make sure you tell a story that actually, but if someone believes that thing, just don't try to say you're wrong. Because I know it's another story. Say, that's your story, it's my story. But try to think about it, that actually, you know, and by the way, then the head of government, chief advisor, was incredibly right, and actually talking about things that suddenly globally appealed to business people, to quite center-right people, to capitalists, if I may call it. They say, oh yeah, we're just unlocking people's potential. Yeah, all are entrepreneurs. Oh, I'm a rich person, I'm an entrepreneur. I like the idea that I give a bit of money to a low-level entrepreneur. It makes me feel better. And I can relate to it because it's not a handout, it's promoting entrepreneurship. Now that's a story that works, and we know very well that it worked very well. However strong or not the evidence was sometimes around certain forms of these programs. These are storytelling. Okay, it's very powerful, but you understand, nothing really about difficult things like accountability. If the business people or the politicians think you're just targeting them, even though they say, but it's a system that works for us. This is how the world works, because actually I can't think of another way that this works. You better understand that and look for your entry points. The stories you tell need to be consistent with these things. So that's we call this framing, you know. This is what advertising agents do all the time to you. They try to actually get an image that you can relate to, and then you have, suddenly they're carrying a particular type of bag. Or they suddenly, it's cool to have some kind of a paper cup with a plastic lid up and drink your coffee like that, while you always had extremely good coffee otherwise. But suddenly, that's how it should look like, because you can suddenly look a bit like Silicon Valley or look like something cool. That's how they do it, but you understand how you tell the story. Okay? Don't lie in the stories. Don't be Musk, okay? Don't lie in the stories. Don't be Trump or Musk. But you still have to tell a story based on the evidence that there is, okay? And that leads me to the final thing. And this is where I feel very sorry to the advisors now, and some of the senior politicians as well. Oh my God, you're all asking so much. There's so much going on. And every day, you end up, as a result, firefighting. And every day someone asks me, when is the election? Oh, you know what to do? And I say something like the planning advisor said the other day, 1 year. So, oh, it's 1 year. Well, we just thought so, and so on. Basically, there's so much going on. The expectations are so high. The 69 points, if I'm not mistaken, from the students, and the 60 from the BNP as red lines or whatever, you know, that you can't handle that in your head. It's not about politically or implementation-wise. You can't handle that in your head. I can't find, as a kind of technical person, a solution to something that brings all these things together. So they become to be responsive to what happens to be on their mind at that moment. And it's called bandwidth. People have limited bandwidth. If you want to be effective, recognize that people will have limited bandwidth. And so you can keep on shouting, but at some point they close their ears because they can't deal with it anymore. So what you then actually, how do you use this? It's very smartly. And okay, let me give you one example very quickly. It's an example in the United Kingdom. And you may or may not have ever heard about Blue Planet, David Attenborough, a documentary from the BBC. So I get some nodding. People recognize it. It's basically about 7 years ago, there was a series about blue ocean where they showed that there was a lot of plastics in the ocean, the little pellets. You know, a lot of people know, everybody knows. Now, that's all due to this one man, the production company of the BBC, bringing out a documentary that was amazing. When it came out in the UK in November 2017, it was headline news, suddenly. It was discussed in Parliament because it was so good. It captured the imagination of youth, especially. Kids in school talked about it because it was so clear. Is the ocean full of small little plastic pellets? Is the thing, and suddenly a thing. I remember being in the government at the time as chief economist of 𝗍𝗏. But actually, I also didn't know it then, but I learned later on that 7 months earlier, a bunch of scientists in the UK had produced a landmark report on this, commissioned by the government. You know, call it a white paper or something like that, to use the right terms from today. You commission it, and it comes on the desk. And it had a whole discussion of this issue together with a whole series of other issues to do with the oceans. Very well researched and so on. As it is appropriate, because it's a government commissioned and it was the chief scientist, it went to the Prime Minister with a little note, I know exactly, so a little cover, oh, Prime Minister, you should read this, as per procedure, you get this and you need to acknowledge that you've seen it. It got in her box together with this kind of pile of paper. There's this usually sets of red boxes that are in the UK. It went to her office over the weekend and it came back with a obligatory little pencil tick next to the title, which was her sign that she'd read it. This was Theresa May. Of course we know she never read it. It can't. There's too many things going on. And this is something about that feels important, but it's so long run, you can't deal with it. It's big reform, something. Okay, but what happened in 2017 in November, the day after the documentary? It was all of the newspapers, it was all discussed. A smart civil servant put the same report back into the box as if it had never gone to her before. And of course she read it in the weekend. And the next Monday, every government department, including us, and I remember being puzzled, we got commissioned, can you get us a series of proposals of how to actually reduce the plastics in the ocean? Now that's called bandwidth. It's not about they're wrong, they don't use science, they don't use advocacy evidence, they pick their moment. And that civil servant is the hero of the piece, pick the moment. Now that's also something to think about. With all the recommendations you have, the consultations like the things you do, make sure you think carefully about which bit is the right moment for to agitate on or to talk about or to deal with. Because if you do it simply as we usually do, you probably were last week finishing the report and now we need to do it, it's not necessarily the right moment. Strategic patience is the final thing if you deal with people. Being strategically patient because they need to have the bandwidth to understand. Okay, so I'll stop now, but remember 3 things. Understand the politicians you deal with. What are their incentives? Why would they want to spoil it? Why would they want to adopt it? Can you make it enough salient that they should adopt it? The politicians, the vested interests, the business interests in doing it. Secondly, think about implementation. Can it be done? How hard would it be? What would need to be done? And have a real assessment. If you want to do proper advocacy, you need that intelligence from the other side. And then finally, always know you deal with people. They think in a particular way, you need to tell the stories in a particular way so that it can allude to them, that it fits with their mental model and begins to correct it. And then you can actually begin to actually act on it. You get entry points, but then pick your moments. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.